Hello and welcome to episode 22 of the GreenWave podcast by Synergy International. I'm your host, SYNI, and today we're taking you on a whirlwind tour through the global green hydrogen subsidy race. If that sounds like a mouthful, well, it's because the world is biting off quite a lot, pouring unprecedented funds into turning the lightest element in the universe into a heavyweight climate solution. Green hydrogen is touted as a game changer for decarbonising heavy industries and storing renewable energy. But there's a catch. It's still significantly more expensive to produce than its polluting predecessors. The solution? Governments around the world opening their coffers with all the subtlety of a kid in a candy store. In this episode, we'll navigate the twists and turns of this international contest, from massive tax credits and grants to clever auctions and even a bit of geopolitical jockeying, all aimed at making green hydrogen commercially viable. Now, this is a very large subject indeed, so we're going to split it, a bit like an H2O molecule being broken into hydrogen and oxygen atoms, with today's episode covering the US, Australia, the European Union, the United Kingdom, and Canada. And next week, we'll complete our emission-free circumnavigation with focus on Asia, India, Africa, and the Middle East. Let's go. Green hydrogen, the clean fuel made by splitting water with renewable energy, was riding a wave of global enthusiasm not long ago. Governments everywhere were dangling generous subsidies to kickstart this industry, vying to lead in what many dubbed the hydrogen race. But as with any race, the field can change quickly. In the past few months, we've seen dramatic twists. Some nations doubling down on their support for hydrogen, while others have slammed the brakes or even thrown things into reverse. It's been a bit of a roller coaster for those of us tracking sustainable finance and energy policy. So today, we're taking a tour around the world to see where green hydrogen incentives stand, who's charging ahead, who's pulling back, and what it all means for the future of this much-hyped clean energy resource. Let's start in the United States, where the political winds have shifted and, unfortunately, for green hydrogen fans, they're blowing against the hydrogen hype, at least at the federal level. Just a couple years ago, the US made global headlines with the Inflation Reduction Act, lovingly known as the IRA, which put in place some of the world's most attractive incentives for green hydrogen. That law offered tax credits up to a whopping $3 per kilogram of clean hydrogen produced, a potential game changer that had investors flocking and new projects sprouting up across the country. It wasn't just hydrogen. The IRA showered all kinds of clean energy with support, from solar and wind to electric vehicles, truly a green bonanza. Fast forward to early 2025, and America's political landscape did a 180. A new administration under President Donald Trump has taken the helm, and one of its first orders of business was, quite literally, ripping up parts of the previous administration's climate legacy. In late January, mere days after inauguration, the Donald signed an executive order with a characteristically understated title, Terminating the Green New Deal. In practice, this sweeping order halted disbursement of funds from the Inflation Reduction Act's programs, pending a top-to-bottom review. Picture the reaction of clean energy companies opening their email to find that all those grants and loans they were promised are now on hold. Not the happiest start to the year for them. The White House tried to clarify that the pause was temporary, focused on programs that conflict with the new administration's priorities, like, say, anything that smelled too climate-friendly. But it sent a chill through the industry. Those much-anticipated hydrogen production tax credits, known as Section 45V credits, are suddenly on uncertain ground. Projects that were banking on a decade of subsidies may be re-crunching their numbers as we speak. And it wasn't just executive orders causing heartburn in Hydrogen Land USA. On Capitol Hill, the partisan tug-of-war over clean energy spending ignited almost immediately. House Republicans, newly emboldened, rolled out what they nicknamed the One Big, Beautiful Bill, presumably because nothing says beauty like slashing clean energy budgets. In this sprawling proposal, they aimed to extend some popular business tax cuts, but to pay for it, they took a knife to President Biden's climate programs. High on their hit list, the IRA's clean energy tax credits, including the hydrogen production credit. The House Ways and Means Committee put forward language to terminate the hydrogen credit entirely by 2026, a full 7 years early from its original 2033 sunset. In essence, they want to yank away the punch bowl just as the hydrogen party was getting started. For a credit that was once hailed as transformative, giving investors confidence to build electrolyzers and green ammonia plants on US soil, this move threatens to gut its long-term value. It's like promising a 10-year incentive and then saying, oops, you really only get 2 years. You can imagine the outrage and lobbying frenzy from renewable energy groups in response. Now, whether these rollbacks fully stick is a complex question. While the administration can freeze or slow walk spending, outright repeal of tax credits has to go through Congress. With a slim majority in the House and the Senate controlled, barely, by Republicans as of early 2025, a lot of this might become high-stakes political theatre rather than immediate law. But uncertainty alone can be damaging. Companies contemplating multi-billion-dollar hydrogen projects, chemical companies, energy startups, utilities, they now have to factor in the risk that Washington's support is on the clock to vanish or shrink. And states that were hoping to build hydrogen hubs with federal money, remember the $8 billion for regional hydrogen hubs announced last year, are in limbo as the funding spigot is turned off for review. The contrast from 1 year ago is stark. In 2024, the US was charging forward. The Department of Energy had just named several hydrogen hub winners across states like Texas, California, the Midwest, and Appalachia, aiming to create networks of production and end use. There was buzz about the US becoming a top destination for green hydrogen investment thanks to the IRA credits. Even talk of projects that might export hydrogen derivatives to Europe or Asia. Now, with the new administration, the narrative has flipped. The emphasis is back on fossil fuels, unleashing American oil, gas, and coal, as the Donald puts it, and skepticism about climate initiatives. The US retracted its hand from the Paris Agreement, again, signaling to the world that federal climate leadership is on hold. In short, American hydrogen policy has gone from full speed ahead to hitting a big speed bump, if not a complete U-turn. This about-face in Washington, however, is not mirrored everywhere. Let's travel now to the Southern Hemisphere for a very different story. Down in Australia, green hydrogen is enjoying a tailwind of political support, basically the opposite scenario of the US, thanks to a recent election that gave the industry a big sigh of relief. In May 2025, Australian voters went to the polls for a federal election. The lead-up was tense for the clean energy sector because the opposition, a Liberal national coalition led by Peter Dutton, had openly scoffed at the government's hydrogen plans. Dutton at one point lambasted green hydrogen as a fantasy project and vowed that if he came to power, he would scrap the major hydrogen incentives put in place by the current Labour government. He even flirted with the nuclear option, literally suggesting lifting Australia's ban on nuclear energy, and argued that hydrogen was a distraction from immediate issues like household energy prices. In short, Australia's burgeoning hydrogen industry, which was just finding its feet, faced an existential threat from the election. Then came the results. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's Labour Party not only won, but won big, securing a comfortable majority and even expanding their seats. It was a landslide that few saw coming given some earlier polls. And with it came a clear mandate to continue, and likely ramp up, the country's clean energy transition, hydrogen included. The Australian Hydrogen Council practically cheered from the rooftops. Fiona Simon, the council's CEO, said the result was welcome news because it affirmed that hydrogen policy would remain supportive and stable, no sudden rug-pulling of incentives. After holding their tongues during the campaign for fear of being seen as too political, industry stakeholders could finally exhale and even celebrate a bit. So, what does this mean on the ground in Australia? It means that key initiatives like Hydrogen Head Start, a government program that earmarked $4 billion Australian dollars, about $2.6 billion US dollars, to support large-scale renewable hydrogen projects, will move forward without being axed. It also means that planned production tax credits for hydrogen, reportedly worth over 14 billion Australian dollars over the coming years, are likely safe. These Aussie tax credits are akin to a homegrown version of the US IRA incentives, designed to make green hydrogen cost-competitive with dirtier alternatives. Under a Dutton government, those would have been toast. Under Albanese's strengthened second term, they're full steam ahead. The government in its first term had laid out ambitious goals and some funding. Now, with a new mandate, we can expect them to double down, perhaps even increasing hydrogen funding in future budgets or accelerating related infrastructure plans. The broader clean energy community in Australia also took heart. Beyond hydrogen, Labor's win suggests continuity in policies for renewables, electric vehicles, and decarbonisation efforts. But hydrogen is a special focus because Australia sees itself as a potential export powerhouse in a future hydrogen economy. The country's vast solar and wind resources, especially in places like Western Australia and Queensland, could be harnessed to produce green hydrogen or ammonia and ship it to energy-hungry markets like Japan, South Korea, and Europe. With political uncertainty put to rest, international investors eyeing Aussie hydrogen projects, from electrolysis plants to export terminals, have a clearer runway. In fact, one could cheekily say that if hydrogen was used as a political football in this election, it turned out that kicking that football didn't score any points for the opposition. Voters instead seemed to endorse the vision of Australia riding the GreenWave, to borrow our show's favourite metaphor, to become a leader in the hydrogen arena. Score 1 for stability and optimism in the land down under. Now, let's hop over to Europe, where momentum around green hydrogen has been strong and continues to build, albeit with a characteristically European approach, structured, somewhat bureaucratic perhaps, but effective in its own way. Instead of the free-form tax credits favoured in America, the European Union has embraced a more controlled mechanism, the European Hydrogen Bank, and its competitive auctions for subsidies. The idea here is to efficiently use public funds by getting companies to bid for the minimum subsidy they'd need to make their hydrogen projects viable. Essentially, it's a reverse auction. Projects compete, and those that can produce hydrogen with the least subsidy win the support. It's a bit like the Hunger Games for hydrogen developers, though fortunately a lot less deadly, unless you count CO2 emissions as the target to kill. In May 2025, the EU announced the results of its second hydrogen bank auction, and the outcome is pretty encouraging if you're rooting for the hydrogen economy. 15 projects across the EU, and even some in closely linked countries like Norway, emerged as winners, securing a total of nearly €1 billion in subsidies to be paid out over the next 10 years. These projects are scattered across 5 countries, and collectively are expected to produce around 2.2 million tonnes of renewable hydrogen over their 10-year subsidy period. To put that in perspective, that's hydrogen to feed a lot of industrial processes, refineries, fertiliser plants, maybe fuel for some trucks or trains, without the carbon footprint of the usual fossil-derived hydrogen. The auctions were oversubscribed several times over. More than 60 bids poured in, requesting about 4 times the budget available. Clearly, European industry is eager to hop on the hydrogen train if the EU is helping sweeten the economics. What's interesting is that Europe isn't just throwing money blindly. They're trying to aim it where it could catalyse broader changes. In this second auction round, they set aside a portion of the budget specifically for projects that supply hydrogen to the maritime sector. Think shipping fuel, port uses, etc. Shipping is notoriously hard to decarbonise, so the EU basically said, all right, we'll give extra love and cash to hydrogen projects that help clean up maritime emissions. Norway, with its long seafaring traditions, snagged a few of these maritime-focused awards. 3 projects in Norway got about €97 million to produce hydrogen that will go into things like clean shipping fuel, possibly in the form of ammonia or direct hydrogen for fuel cells. And if you think about it, a Norwegian fjord could be a great place to pilot green vessels running on hydrogen, zero emissions cruising past those majestic cliffs. Another noteworthy element, some EU member states added their own money on top to fund additional projects that met the auction criteria but didn't get EU funding due to the budget limit. Spain, Lithuania and Austria together ponied up over €800 million in national funds to support projects in their home countries that just missed the cut in the EU-level competition. This auctions as a service model, as Brussels dubs it, lets countries piggyback on the EU auction process to select solid projects and then fund them nationally if Brussels can't. It's a clever synergy of EU and national efforts, ultimately funneling even more money into building the hydrogen supply. Looking ahead, Europe is far from done. The EU has already flagged a third hydrogen bank auction, slated for late 2025, with another €1 billion up for grabs. And beyond these Innovation Fund-backed auctions, member states have their own pots of money. Germany, for example, has been rolling out its H2 global scheme, a sort of auction to subsidise imported green hydrogen. And countries like France and the Netherlands have national strategies with billions earmarked for hydrogen infrastructure, electrolyser deployment, and research. The EU also finalised rules defining what counts as green or renewable hydrogen, additionality rules for electricity, etc., providing long-awaited regulatory certainty. That clarity, plus the lure of subsidies, means Europe is likely to remain one of the most dynamic regions for hydrogen development. If the US stumbles due to politics, European policymakers seem happy to entice any would-be hydrogen investors to look east across the Atlantic. One can almost imagine EU officials cheekily sending memos to American green tech companies. Come on over, our subsidy auctions are open for business, and our political climate won't cancel your contract by tweet or executive order. Across the Channel, the United Kingdom is also pushing forward with hydrogen support, though with its own distinct strategy. Britain, no longer part of the EU, isn't participating in those hydrogen bank auctions. Instead, it has crafted something called the Hydrogen Business Model, which is essentially a government-backed contract for difference, CFD scheme. Now, if your eyes glazed over at contract for difference, don't worry. All it means is the government will pay hydrogen producers the gap between the market price and a fixed strike price to ensure they can operate profitably. It's similar to how the UK spurred offshore wind development in the past decade. So far, that model is bearing fruit. The UK held its first hydrogen allocation round, HAR1, over the last year, a competitive process to pick the first batch of low-carbon hydrogen projects to support. The results of that first round came in a bit underwhelming in terms of volume. They ended up with 11 projects totalling about 125 megawatts of electrolyser capacity to receive support, roughly half of what they initially aimed for, which was 250 megawatts. But hey, 125 megawatts is still significant. It's like a handful of decent-sized green hydrogen plants. And these are among the first commercial-scale hydrogen projects in the world to get real government-backed contracts. By the end of 2024, the UK government had already offered contracts, called low-carbon hydrogen agreements, to 3 of those projects, allowing them to reach final investment decision and start construction. The remaining 8 selected projects were slated to get their agreements by early 2025. If all goes smoothly, the very first of these UK-supported hydrogen plants could be up and running before the end of 2025, producing clean hydrogen for industrial hubs in England or Scotland. Hot on the heels of the first round, Britain launched Hydrogen Allocation Round 2, HAR2, in late 2023, aiming much bigger, up to 875 megawatts of electrolytic hydrogen capacity supported. And the interest has been enormous. They reportedly got 87 applications, representing about 2.8 gigawatts of potential projects. That's more than 3 times oversubscribed. Clearly, British industry is saying, "We have loads of projects ready, give us the contracts and we'll build them." By mid-2025, the government is in the process of sifting through those bids, likely shortlisting the winners. With that level of competition, they can afford to pick the best value-for-money projects. It wouldn't surprise me if by late 2025 they announce that nearly the full 875 megawatts is awarded, which would be a massive jump in scale from round 1. And the UK isn't stopping there. They're already talking about HAR3 and HAR4 in the coming years, and even considering moving toward a more auction-based approach, like the EU style, for future rounds once the market matures beyond these initial negotiated deals. One aspect to note is the UK's technology-inclusive stance. While the first allocation rounds have focused mostly on green hydrogen, electrolysis from renewables, the UK is also actively promoting blue hydrogen from natural gas with carbon capture as part of its decarbonisation plan. They have a whole separate programme linked to their carbon capture and storage CCS cluster projects to support blue hydrogen production in industrial hubs like the Humber and Merseyside. In fact, the government announced a hefty £21.7 billion commitment over 25 years to kickstart a domestic CCS industry, which includes funding for hydrogen made from natural gas in those industrial clusters. So, the UK strategy is two-pronged: green hydrogen in places with lots of renewable power, and blue hydrogen tied to their budding CCS networks. They're aiming for 10 gigawatts of hydrogen capacity by 2030, at least half green. And with these funding mechanisms now rolling, they have a shot at it. Amidst all the Brexit and political drama of recent years, the UK's quiet progress on hydrogen shows a rare bit of cross-party consensus. Building a hydrogen economy is seen as key for industrial regions and for meeting Britain's 2050 net zero goal. Finally, let's talk about Canada. Often in the shadow of its southern neighbour, Canada nonetheless has been quietly building a robust framework for clean hydrogen, in some ways blending the best of US-style incentives and European-style planning. Canada released a comprehensive hydrogen strategy back in 2020, and since then has been working steadily to implement it. By 2025, things have really picked up pace, especially as Canada plays both offense and defense vis-à-vis the US IRA. Well, the original pro-climate IRA vision. Offense in attracting investment and positioning for exports. Defense in ensuring its own industries don't flee to the US for richer subsidies. One of the crown jewels of Canada's plan is the new Clean Hydrogen Investment Tax Credit, ITC. Knowing that the US had a production tax credit, Canada opted for an investment side credit. In 2023 and finalised by mid-2024, Canada's federal government introduced a hydrogen ITC that offers between 15% and 40% back on the capital investments for clean hydrogen projects. The exact percentage depends on how low carbon the hydrogen is. The cleaner, the higher the credit, and certain labour requirements. They encourage projects with good labour standards by tying full credit value to those conditions. So, if a company builds a $1 billion green hydrogen plant in Alberta or Quebec, they could get up to $400 million as a refundable tax credit from the federal government. That's huge. It substantially de-risks investment, almost like the government becoming a significant silent partner in every project. And unlike the US production credit, which pays out over time per kilogram, the Canadian credit helps with the upfront cost, which is often the biggest hurdle. By late 2024, these investment tax credits were law and open for business. So in 2025, we're seeing project developers across Canada factoring that into their finances. For instance, a project in Newfoundland that plans to use wind power to make hydrogen and convert it to ammonia for export. They can count on the ITC to cover a chunk of their wind farm and electrolyser costs. There are quite a few export-oriented projects like that in eastern Canada, thanks in part to a high-profile Canada-Germany hydrogen alliance signed in 2022. That agreement basically said, Germany will look to import Canadian hydrogen, likely as ammonia, by as early as 2025/2026, and both governments will support their companies to make it happen. One project, called Everwind in Nova Scotia, is aiming to be first out the gate. They even got German companies lined up to possibly buy their ammonia. The tax credit sweetens those deals, making it more feasible to meet the price that overseas buyers can pay. Out west, Canada's oil and gas heartland, Alberta, is pivoting some of its resources to hydrogen as well, particularly blue hydrogen. Alberta has abundant natural gas and experience with carbon capture, with the Quest project, etc., so it's primed to make low-carbon hydrogen from methane. The provincial government there and in neighbouring Saskatchewan are on board. They see hydrogen as a way to monetize gas in a carbon-constrained future, and also to supply fuel for heavy industries like petrochemicals and even heavy-duty transportation. Federal support combines with provincial initiatives. Alberta, for instance, has its own hydrogen roadmap and is investing in infrastructure like pipelines that could carry hydrogen or blending hydrogen into existing natural gas networks for home heating trials. Another area Canada focuses on is fuel cell technology and vehicles, playing to their strengths. Canadian company Ballard Power is a global leader in fuel cells. The government has been supporting domestic adoption of fuel cell buses, for example, a cluster in Vancouver, and development of hydrogen refueling corridors for trucks between Montreal and Toronto. The Strategy Progress report in 2024 noted that about $100+ billion in potential investments had been announced across some 80 hydrogen projects in Canada, an enormous figure reflecting big plans, though not all will reach fruition soon. These include everything from small-scale electrolysis to supply hydrogen for metal refining in Quebec, to large-scale carbon-captured hydrogen in Edmonton's industrial zone, to even exploring natural hydrogen, geologic hydrogen, in northern Canada, interestingly. Where Canada stands out is tying hydrogen into its broader climate policy and economic plan. It's one pillar of their aim to get to net zero by 2050 and also to create jobs, especially in regions that might be affected by a global decline in fossil fuels. And they are conscious of competition. If the US IRA had proceeded without Canadian response, they worried investors would all flock south. But now, with the US in a bit of disarray on the climate front and Canada offering certainty via the ITC and other grants, like the Strategic Innovation Fund that has given money to some hydrogen projects, Canada looks relatively stable and attractive. One might joke that Canada's biggest challenge is its own niceness. They need to shout from the rooftops a bit more about their hydrogen incentives to ensure global investors notice the opportunity, especially if the US retreats. But within industry circles, the word is out. Canada is serious about hydrogen. Well, that's a wrap on our 22nd GreenWave podcast episode, and stay tuned for our Green Hydrogen Subsidy Part 2 in our 23rd episode next week. We appreciate you sharing your time. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeart, Podchaser, Boomplay, and Player FM, so feel free to follow the pod and share with friends. We'd love if you would leave a review. If you have missed any of our LinkedIn posts or the GreenWave Gazette, you can always catch us on LinkedIn, X, Facebook, Instagram, or visit synergy-international.net. We'll keep reflecting on the trends shaping sustainable finance and global policy. Until next time, keep riding the green wave of sustainability. Stay inspired and keep advocating for a healthier planet, one green hydrogen subsidy program at a time.